And if you have any questions for Catherine, just submit it in the chat box below. I'll type something so you know where to look. Perfect, Catherine. We can see your screen now.
Okay, perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. I'm assuming either you have business space already or you're thinking about moving your at-home business to retail or office space. So this is kind of just an overview of things that you should consider as an entrepreneur. So just to give you a little background about me and who I am and why I kind of know what I'm talking about. I've been doing this for over 10 years. I started my career working in-house for the big landlords, the different REITs, Canadian Tire, Loblaws, those kind of landlords and tenants. I was writing the leases on the landlord side and doing portfolio audits on the tenant side, making sure they weren't being overcharged by the landlord. And then I decided to start my own business because working for landlords, really your only choice is to go downtown Toronto, and I wanted to stay closer to home. So I started my own business. This is the third year I've been doing it on my own. I work for a bunch of the tenants that you can see here, a couple of the landlords, and my goal was to help the small independent tenants. As entrepreneurs, you're really underrepresented when it comes to leasing business space, especially if you're looking to get into the bigger malls or the bigger office towers. So that's really why I developed my business. And one thing that I want to share with you guys, if you have an Android phone, I did develop an app, and you can find it. It's free in the Google Play Store, and you can download it, and it helps you do some calculations to see if the place is affordable, because sometimes commercial rates are broken out differently than just a lump sum a month. So that's something that I've done in the last year. Okay, so just as an overview, the point of the lease is a list of the rights and responsibilities of both parties. So that's the landlord and the tenant in this scenario. And some things that we're going to go over today are crucial clauses for tenants. So one big area that I think tenants don't really understand is how they're paying their CAM costs. Sometimes it's referred to as CAM, sometimes you hear your realtors call it TMI, or landlords refer to it as operating costs. But it's basically the common area of whatever property you're in, the costs associated with that, and how they're recovered by the landlord and charged back to you. So it's a very complicated calculation, and it's important that you kind of understand that. Otherwise, you can be paying for things that you really shouldn't be paying for. And then another area I wanted to touch on was some different tenant rights that you can build into the lease. So we'll talk about relocation, parking, exclusives and restrictions, first right of offer or refusal. There's a technical difference there, and extension options. So like I said, operating costs are the charges passed on by the landlord to the tenant for operating, and then that definition is usually expanded in the lease to include maintaining, administering, repairing, all the things that go along with taking care of the property. So the four key definitions that you want to focus on when you're looking at the lease are the definition of the operating costs, of what they call proportionate share. And in that definition of proportionate share, they're going to talk about the shopping center. And in the definition of shopping center, they're going to talk about majors. So these are kind of the four definitions that you want to have a look at and make sure you understand, because it will really impact your bottom line cost. And this might be a little bit complicated when I'm talking about it, but once I get to the end screen where I look at the numbers, you can see how these words really impact your bottom line. So the operating costs are, the tenant usually pays their proportionate share of the cost, like I said, to operate and maintain the common elements of the property. So they're usually in a very sophisticated lease, they will outline exactly what you're paying for. So it'll talk about garbage removal, snow removal, sanding, salting, doing landscaping and flower beds, cleaning exterior windows. It'll list specifically all of these things. If you look at something very simple like the OREA form of lease, which it's something very common for realtors, especially if you've got a residential realtor dabbling in commercial, they'll pull that OREA form and use that template. That template is very vague when it talks about the operating costs. And a lot of clients that come to me afterwards say, well, you know, my landlord hasn't been doing X, Y, or Z, and it's not specifically mentioned in the operating costs. So it's important when you're looking at a place, take a look at the common areas and think about things that you would want to make sure are maintained and kept up to the standard that you're looking at when you look at a property. So is there exterior lighting? Is there areas that need to have snow removed? Are there walkways that you would be concerned about your clients coming in and slipping and falling, and you want to make sure there's lots of salt available for that and all those good things? So the next thing that you want to focus on is the definition of proportionate share. So it's a fraction, and it usually means your area, the tenant's area, over the total area of the shopping center. So sometimes that's a really easy calculation. It's one big building, it's divided into 4, there's 4 tenant areas, they're all equal space, you're paying a quarter of the cost. Most centers aren't built like that, so the calculation isn't that simple. And when the lease talks about the tenant's area over the area of the shopping center, that'll be a capitalized, another defined term. And what the landlord's sophisticated, complicated shopping centers will do is they will exclude some tenants from that definition of the shopping center. Usually those tenants are referred to as your majors. So that's where this last definition kind of comes into play. And those majors are, you know, big box stores, pads that are kind of standalone and maybe not attached to the enclosed mall. They could be the second floor office tenants. It could be kiosks. It could be basement, mezzanine. There's a whole category of tenants that landlords will exclude from the definition of shopping center. So it's important that you understand that, because the more tenants that are excluded from that definition of shopping center, the smaller that number gets and the bigger your proportionate share ends up being. So it's really important that you understand that. So here's a great example, and probably overwhelming example, of a very sophisticated landlord's definition of operating costs and things that they would charge back to the tenant. So I've kind of highlighted in pink here words that stand out and make sense because it's a lease, so it's extra wordy. So you're paying for your gardening, your landscaping, you're paying for insurance, cleaning, pest control, recycling, snow removal, garbage. There's a lot of things that you're paying for. So it's important, if you are signing a form of lease like this with a big landlord, that you scrutinize these costs and see what's actually applicable to you. There's a lot of things, like if you look at salary and benefits, I'll give you a little tidbit of information here. A lot of times, bigger landlords, they don't have any on-site staff at that shopping center, especially if it's a small strip plaza. So you could be paying the salary and benefits for all of, because if you look there, so I'm looking at XI here. And so it's salary and benefits of all supervisionary and other personnel employed in connection with the shopping center. So that's everyone at their head office that's working on that shopping center. That can be a lot. So something that tenants that I work with, we often ask for is, you know, it's fair that we pay for any salaries for people that are on site, but that's it. So there's lots of things in here that you can drill down and kind of ask for concessions if you know what you're asking for. So here's the schedule where all of those definitions kind of come into play. So what you're seeing here is these columns here are the different tenants at the center, and you can see this is just a basic standard tenant, and then these are names of different tenants that have negotiated special terms in their lease. So the first section here is all of the expenses that the landlord's charging back to these tenants. Then you have here the calculation where we're taking out the amounts that were contributed by the major tenants, so what I talked about before. And you can see here, based on numbers that are included or excluded, the definition of majors for the standard tenant and for Tim's included, it either talked about a pharmacy, or maybe it talked about premises over 6,000 square feet, or whatever the case is, this PharmaSave tenant falls into that category. But they didn't for these other three tenants in the middle here. Then when you come down here, they've excluded some costs from the admin fee. So it's only fair that you don't pay an admin fee on top of admin costs. Carlson was smart enough to catch that, and they negotiated that out of their lease. So when you look down at the bottom number here, the total operating costs and admin fee per square foot, look how much it varies per tenant, depending on what they were able to negotiate out of the language of the operating cost, right? So this illustration, I think, speaks volumes about how important it is to scrutinize those different areas and those different definitions. And, you know, a standard tenant who just took the lease as is paying $3.72 a square foot. Meanwhile, we've got a savvy tenant over here who's negotiated down to $1.81. So that's something I just wanted to highlight for you. And of course, this is condensed substantially. These Excel spreadsheets go on for miles, but I just wanted to screenshot it in a way that we could just quickly highlight the importance of it. So another thing that I want to talk about is your rights as a tenant are also the landlord's responsibilities. So certain sections of a lease give the tenant special rights, and if the landlord breaches these clauses, there could be substantial penalties. One of those things is relocation. So this gives the landlord the ability to move the tenant from one unit to another, and usually a savvy tenant will negotiate a few caveats to protect their business. So that's one thing that I wanted to address with you guys, because I've seen both things happen. Either you've got a really flimsy lease or offer, maybe the OREA form or something like that, that doesn't speak to relocation at all. And maybe it just has vague language that says the landlord has the ability to reconfigure the center. And then they use that to be able to move you around. And then the other issue is when you have a sophisticated landlord, all of their leases always include a clause where they can relocate the tenant, period. So you need to be able to go in and soften up that language. And I know from sitting on the landlord side that most of the time they're usually agreeable to these things. So it's common, and it's a simple ask to say that the relocation is going to be at the landlord's cost. And usually you can even get the landlord to agree to things like paying for your stationery that now needs to be changed because your address has changed, or ads that you've taken out that now the address isn't correct, so long as the address really affects your business, right? Something else is a significant notice period. So typical is 60 days notice, but I've seen the bigger tenants get 365 days notice, or even smaller tenants have fought for 180 days notice. It really depends on how long it's going to take you to get your ducks in a row. before you need to be able to move. Oh, I see a question here. What would happen in the case a building was sold or closes and you still have 3 years lease left to go? That's a great question. So the basics of real estate law is that leases run with the land. So whether it's residential or commercial, there's no difference there. Your lease transfers to the new owner. One big difference between residential and commercial is people know that if you're going to buy it to occupy it, then you can give the tenant notice and you can take it over. That's not the same rule in commercial. And most leases do have a clause in it that specifically states when the land is transferred, that the new owner will accept all the terms of the lease. And what usually happens there is during the purchase and sale due diligence, the tenants will be asked to sign estoppel certificates that will confirm the remaining amount of the term and the rent, and if they have any issues outstanding with the landlord, so that the new landlord understands what they're getting into, and that you don't really have any discrepancies on term or rent or extension options or anything like that, because the tenants have kind of confirmed it before the sale takes place. So going back to the relocation, another thing that you can ask is that you be relocated to a similar premise. So something very sophisticated, strong tenants would ask for is similar frontage, size, configuration, and exposure to traffic. Now, the exposure to traffic one is one that landlords are usually hesitant to give because it's something that's really difficult to measure. But a similar frontage, a similar size and configuration, those are really common, simple asks that you want to take into account. Because, you know, if you currently have a store that is very deep and that works for your layout and your merchandising, and they want to relocate you to something that's now a completely different configuration, it's not going to work. And all of your fixtures and all of those things won't be able to translate into the new premise. So it's a fair ask. Another thing that some of the smaller tenants forget to ask for are parking requirements. So if you've got short-term parking stalls that you want to ask for because you have a lot of clients that are just quickly running in and out and it's more convenient for them to be close to the door, that's definitely a simple ask. And especially if you're willing to pay for the cost and installation of the signage, a lot of times, depending on the parking ratios, the tenant or the landlord will be willing to give it to you. So it's important that you understand what your clients and customers are going to want as far as your parking, and that you build that into the lease so that you don't end up with a situation where you're a year and a half into the lease and you discover that you've got no sales because no one can park and come in. So this is one of my favorite stories to tell, and I think it's so important that tenants really think about this because landlords certainly are now. So you have the ability to ask for an exclusive use or restrict other uses that are going to happen in the plaza, because either you don't want that direct competition, or sometimes you want to control the type of clientele that's coming into the property. So a lot of times you'll see in your Walmart leases, they'll have prohibited uses, restricted uses. They don't want bingo halls. They don't want strip clubs. They don't want anything selling illegal merchandise or illegal substances or anything like that. I've even seen in some plus size clothing stores that they've restricted gyms or health food stores because they don't want those things in the same plaza where their customers are going to be, because they know the type of customers that they're targeting. And it's not people that are actively going to the gym and eating healthy food all the time. So this funny story, and why I have a picture of Roger's video, is because when I was working out in Saskatchewan, Saskatchewan has a telephone company in the province called SaskTel. And way back when we still had Rogers Video, and Rogers was Rogers Video, Rogers Video had a store in our plaza for this landlord that I worked for. And we also had a SaskTel store in our plaza. Rogers, their use clause, because every lease describes exactly how you can use your premise, said that they could carry on the business of any Rogers, any store similar to the tenant operating in anywhere in Canada. So that was very vague. But at the time, they were operating as Rogers Video, and landlord signed off on it. SaskTel's use clause was very specific, that they were a telephone company offering telephone services, etc. Now, fast forward 10 years, and Rogers Video no longer exists, and now Rogers has decided to turn this location into Rogers Wireless Store. Now, they're within their right to do that because their use clause says it's going to operate similar to any of the other locations across Canada, and that's what Rogers has done because now nobody's renting videos anymore. But in SaskTel's lease, SaskTel has an exclusive on providing telecommunication services. So now the landlord's hands are tied, and I'll tell you that it ended up costing them a lot of money to satisfy both tenants. So, and now that landlord absolutely never allows that kind of language, and very specific on how you describe the tenant's use. But it's interesting how something can evolve over time and really impact the other tenancies around them. So it's something to think about if you have a business that could evolve or will evolve, to ensure that you have that language in your use clause that gives you the flexibility to do that, but also that changing your use isn't going to affect any other exclusives that the landlord might already have on the property. So another thing that a tenant can ask for, and this is something you're going to want to think about for future, like you're planning 10, 15 years down the road, really thinking about how much your business is going to expand. And you can ask for rights on other space that becomes available. Now, you see this a lot of times in office leases, where, you know, they're going to acquire more and more and more staff, especially law firms and things like that. But even small retail strip plazas, there's always the opportunity to demise units, make them bigger, make them smaller. A great example of that locally is on the corner of Main and Ontario, kitty corner to the mall, that strip plaza there with the new burrito place, the Chinese food restaurant. That convenience store, anyone that's long lived Miltonian will know that there was significant amount of unused space in that unit for years, just filled with dust basically. And now you can see what the landlord did was they reduced that space for the tenant. They took a chunk of that. They took a chunk of the old Rogers space, and they ended up with the new burrito unit in the middle. So you want to think about things that are going to happen down the future. And you can ask the landlord, you know, if vacant space becomes available, you can ask either for the right for them to offer it to you before they put it to market, or you can ask for the right to be the first to refuse. So it's listed, they get an offer, they need to present that offer to you first. You have the opportunity to match it, and if you match it, then the space is yours. If you don't match it, then the space is the other person's. That's just very high level. You can build in a lot of caveats, but it's an interesting opportunity to negotiate for more space when you don't even know that you necessarily need it. So it gives you the option to not have to just pick up and leave if your business starts to get big. And then the last thing that I kind of wanted to touch on was the extension and renewal rights. So it's important that you understand what you're getting into, because a lot of times I get a phone call from a tenant and they say, yeah, I have a lease and it's coming up for renewal. I need to know what I can do. And they send me a copy of the lease and it says, well, they were supposed to give the landlord 6 months notice that they wanted to renew, and the lease is expiring in 15 days. So they've missed that deadline. They don't have a renewal option anymore that the landlord needs to abide by. So it's important that, you know, your lease expires in October. Take a look at those terms and how many months notice do you need to notify the landlord. And then there'll also probably, in sophisticated leases, be a date by which the parties need to agree on the rental rate, because usually renewal options are set so far in the future that a landlord and tenant aren't going to agree on what fair market rent is going to be at that time, so they leave it up to negotiation. But you don't want to be negotiating up until the last minute, because what if the parties decide, you know, we're not going to agree, let's just walk away. The landlord needs time to relet that space, and you as a tenant need time to find new space. So it's very important that you make sure that these are diarized, and you've got reminders in your calendar set, and that you're ahead of all these dates, because missing them can really affect your business huge. So that's those are my main points that I kind of wanted to touch on for any entrepreneurs that were looking to start their own business space. You know, my website's there, my phone number, my email. I'm always happy to talk to local tenants. I know Milton can be expensive and difficult to navigate through, so feel free to give me a call, and I'm happy to talk to chamber members for at least 30 minutes for free.
Perfect. Thanks, Catherine. If you have any questions for Catherine, just type them in the chat box. Right now I have a couple, and I'll just ask the first one. If I see a lease sign, is it a good idea to call the number on the sign?
That's a good question. I get so many tenants that's exactly what they've done, and I cringe. It's the worst thing that you can do. I mean, in residential, if you saw a house for sale, you wouldn't call the listing agent, you would call your own agent. You would get a second opinion. So it's no different in commercial leasing. The listing broker and your broker are both getting paid by the landlord, so it doesn't cost you anything. It's just protecting your interest, and I strongly, strongly recommend that that's what you do.
Perfect. Next question. When is the best time for a business owner to contact a company like Jensen Consulting for help?
I would say the best time is when you decide that you're going to start looking for space. You know, I've got a lot of resources that can connect you with commercial realtors that can help. And it's important that we're in discussions before you sign an offer, because a lot of times I have business owners come to me after they've already signed the offer and they want me to review the lease, but they don't realize that terms that you didn't negotiate in the offer are then left out of the lease. So it's really a disadvantage to bring someone like me on later on in the game. It's better to start as early as possible.
Perfect. And last question here. If a business owner is going to a space where they have a very simple deal, do they still need a lease? Yes,
I think it's very important that you document all of the terms. I've had a lot of tenants tell me, my landlord's a great guy. We've been here for 5 years. And the thing is, you never know what's going to happen. And like I said before, the lease runs with the land, not with the landlord. So you want to make sure that it's documented correctly so that when the next person comes in, it doesn't matter whether or not you have a good relationship with them. Everything is clear on paper.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, Catherine. The Chamber really appreciates you doing the presentation. I'm just going to go upcoming events, and then we'll all say goodbye. Tomorrow we have a Ensuring Success for Women in Business at Rattlesnake Point. We have Milton Young Professionals coming up on March 20th, and Business After Hours March 26th. Our next Milton Breakfast Club is Tuesday, April 2nd at Paramount Fine Foods. And finally, we have our Community Awards Gala on April the 12th. And that's just it. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today, and have a good day. Stay warm.